Hey, everybody. So, yesterday I posted the first part of a three-part series that I'm doing right now based on a chapter of a book that I wrote in 2020. That book is called MAGA Seduction, Resisting the Debasement of the Christian Conscience. And the chapter that I'm sharing here is called Vandalism. And I'm sharing it because it's really foundational, I think, to everything that I'm going to be saying this summer whenever I talk about issues around law and order and peaceful protests and things like that. So I recorded the whole chapter at once, but I realized that I think it's a lot easier to digest if I do it in three parts. So in this section today, I'm showing you the second part. Part one was called The Vandalism of Shalom, and that lays a groundwork for this idea that I talk about a lot even now, that human beings are created for shalom, and I define that in the first section. And I talk about a passage from a book by Cornelius Plantinga where he refers to sin as the vandalism of shalom. So when I wrote this chapter in 2020, we were in the middle of a nationwide group of protests that started with the murder of George Floyd. And what you'll hear today is the middle section of that chapter. And this section was the hardest one for me to write, and the hardest one even a couple days ago to read, because it brought back all of these memories from that day. So the reason I'm sharing the chapter again 5 years later is because the core issue is the same. We're dealing with some really complex social issues that bring up strong emotions on every side. And so 5 years ago, it was issues around police conduct and the Black Lives Matter protests. Now, today, it's issues around immigration and the conduct of ICE officers and protests related to all of that. And what we need, whenever these sorts of things happen, what we need are rational leaders. We need calm leadership, and we need loads and loads of grace and truth. So I wrote on Substack yesterday about emotional dysregulation, how when any of us get emotionally dysregulated, we're capable of acting out in some really extreme ways. We don't make good decisions. We're reactive rather than proactive. And so this is why I'm talking about this. Demagogues throughout history thrive on dysregulation. They depend on keeping their followers confused, enraged, and frightened so they can get them to react in some ways that are going to empower the demagogue. And the main tactic that a demagogue is going to use, usually to keep their followers confused, enraged, and frightened, is to lie to them. And Donald Trump lies all day, every day. And so that keeps his people in this state of confusion and rage and fear. So pastors, at least real pastors, want to do the opposite of that. Pastors, and I would say, I would extend this to any good leader, is going to want to help people to get emotionally regulated. A good leader, like a good pastor, knows that the best way to help people get regulated is first, yes, to acknowledge what they're feeling, to acknowledge what they're going through, not to cast judgment pro or con on what they're feeling, but to validate it. It's to validate that what they're feeling is important. And it's understandable that they're feeling confused, enraged, or frightened. But here's the difference between a good leader and a demagogue. The demagogue looks for those same things, looks for the things that confuse, enrage, or frighten people, not to validate and help to move on, but instead they look for those things in order to amplify them, to crank up those feelings that the followers are feeling, crank those up to 11. So the people in that dysregulated state just look to the demagogue then to act forcefully against the people that the demagogue says are the ones who are to blame for their confusion and their rage and their fear. So a good leader, on the other hand, acknowledges those things, validates the feelings, but then walks alongside the people as they find a way out of that heightened state. And you do that by telling the truth, I mean, the main thing that has to happen is you do it by telling the truth. You replace the lies that they've been fed with truth. And you show grace at every step of the way, grace to everyone involved. I fail at this, the grace part, a lot. I fail at less when I'm on video than I do in my personal life, but we all have to work on this, how to balance grace and truth as we're dealing with these really heightened situations. So that's why I'm sharing this chapter now, 5 years after the George Floyd protests. It was written during the 2020 campaign. And the core issue is the same as what we're dealing with now. A demagogic president is once again intentionally fanning the flames in our culture in order to keep his followers in a state of confusion and rage and fear. His goal is for them to throw away a true understanding of justice. A true understanding of justice. He doesn't want that. Instead, he wants them to accept a perverted law and order brand of justice. That's what demagogues want. So I don't talk about Trump specifically very much in this next section. Instead, it's my best attempt to show the horror of what happened to George Floyd and to talk about why people chose to protest, but also to show how complex the issues are. So in this section, I also talk about several other incidents in my city that paint a picture of how difficult it is to arrive at a shared sense of truth and a shared way forward. It's hard under the best circumstances. And that's my point in this section, is to say this stuff is really hard. So we need to be wise, and we need to reject leaders who try to weaponize our fears or add to our confusion in times like these. So now one final note. I made a choice for this section to not use any pictures as I read it. I think that we've all got the pictures emblazoned in our minds from 5 years ago. I don't think we need to see those again. So for this section, I'm just putting my words from the book on the screen. So thanks for listening. Vandalizing a life that mattered. On May 25th, 2020, 4 Minneapolis police officers murdered George Floyd, a black man, on video. Mr. Floyd had purchased cigarettes at a convenience store with a suspected counterfeit $20 bill. As the officers attempted to arrest him, he displayed visible signs of being under the influence of a substance. With his hands cuffed behind his back, the officers led him to a squad car, and as they tried to get him into the car, he panicked, complaining of claustrophobia. He struggled and ended up on the ground, his face to the pavement, his arms pinned behind his back. While one officer stood guard and menaced the bystanders who pleaded with them to stop, the other 3 knelt on his back and neck, gradually and methodically crushing the life out of him. Murder may not have been their intent, but domination certainly was. And not just domination of the man beneath their knees. They also asserted their lordship over the innocent people who gathered and screamed and pleaded with them to stop. One man reasoned with the officers, pointing out from his own police training how they were putting George Floyd's life at risk. They didn't answer, just stared, grinding the souls of the helpless spectators and those of us who watched it on video and into the asphalt along with George Floyd's body. The senior officer, Derek Chauvin, kept his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck the entire time, through all his gasping yet polite pleas for mercy. "I can't breathe, please, the knee on my neck. I can't breathe, sir." The New York Times writes, Mr. Chauvin, who is white, kept his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck for at least 8 minutes and 15 seconds, according to a Times analysis of time-stamped video. Our video investigation shows that Mr. Chauvin did not remove his knee even after Mr. Floyd lost consciousness, and for a full minute and 20 seconds after paramedics arrived at the scene. At one point, as Mr. Floyd grew unresponsive, one of the spectators lunged almost involuntarily toward the police officers, because that's what human beings do when we witness a man being tortured to death. Chauvin quickly whipped out his mace and pointed it at the bystander, forcing him to back off while Chauvin continued his public execution. George Floyd's life seeped out of his body under Chauvin's knee like so much dust of no value, a nuisance to be swept off the street, nothing more. And all the people pleading and begging, traumatized, helpless to stop the carnage. None of their lives and experiences merited even a slight pause in the cold, clinical snuffing out of this one bothersome, insignificant existence. Seeing it unfold so clearly on video, I felt a sense of rage and helplessness to which I'm not accustomed. But I also felt convicted because this is my city. This is my home. And I should not have been surprised. We've had other episodes like this in the Twin Cities, even on film. On July 6th, 2016, a police officer shot and killed Philando Castile just a few miles from my home during a routine traffic stop, while his partner and her young daughter watched. The officer had asked him to show him his license. Mr. Castile informed the officer that he had a licensed concealed handgun on his person and asked if he should reach for his wallet. A miscommunication of some sort ensued, and as he slowly reached for his wallet, the officer panicked and shot 7 times, hitting Mr. Castile 5 times. Mr. Castile's partner live-streamed the aftermath as he sat in the car bleeding to death from 5 gunshot wounds. So as I watched George Floyd's last moments on video, I knew that whatever level of pain I felt paled in comparison to the pain that people of color have been feeling in my city for a long time. I wondered, if the cops had taken their knees off George Floyd just before he died and managed to revive him, would any of us outside of that neighborhood have ever heard about it? If the brave young woman who filmed the tragedy had not done so, but merely told the story of George Floyd's death, along with the rest of the gathered crowd, would I have believed them? How many similar events have people in my city witnessed over the years that were never recorded? How bad must it have been in the past if this sort of thing still happens today? What does that history do to the Black community in my city? What has it done to me, to my own conscience and capacity for empathy, to participate in a system that would have swept this incident under the rug for most of my lifetime? And when horrific things happen, we often find ourselves asking this fair and honest question: where was Jesus in this? Where was Jesus when justice got the hook and subjugation took center stage? Where was Jesus in George Floyd's final seconds of consciousness as he observed himself stretched out, struggling to breathe, fading, aware he'd been reduced to a helpless public spectacle, knowing he was dying, alone? Where was Jesus? Under Officer Chauvin's knee. Complex issues require wisdom, not division. Human nature tempts us to believe that God sees the world the way we do. I'm certain that's wrong in all cases, because even when we may have a true belief, we can never see an issue in its entirety. I feel the need to bring this up because our nation seems ready to erupt in bloodshed if we all don't check ourselves. Because the president has decided to use violent rhetoric around law and order as his chief political weapon, I, for instance, have begun to hear even more threatening messages from Christians about my own stance against him. No longer am I just accused of wanting to murder babies. I'm also accused now of wanting to burn down cities. And the people accusing me are taking on a harder-edged tone. For example, this week I received numerous messages from an unbalanced person, a law student, who kept using the phrase, "You have been warned." He sent me a section of a pastor's article that he said explains why abortion is worthy of death. I oppose Donald Trump and all his Christian enablers, but I refuse to choose a side in the more complicated cultural issues we're experiencing regarding race, policing, law and order, damage to property, etc. We ought not to have sides in such basic cultural conversations. We ought to have perspectives and argue intelligently for our perspectives. But we must also remain teachable. I oppose police brutality, and I believe it happens far more often to Black people. I oppose looting and burning. I believe we need a police force, but I doubt that force must be structured like many of our existing police departments. And I have a lifetime's worth of learning and correction ahead of me if I want to be able to speak well on those subjects. My personal experiences with the St. Paul Police Department, who were not involved in George Floyd's murder, make me cautious about arriving at any fast and firm conclusions regarding the state of our police force. As a pastor in Frogtown, the least affluent and most ethnically mixed neighborhood in St. Paul, I had the opportunity to observe the St. Paul Police Department on many occasions. When you do ministry in the neighborhood, things just happen from time to time. In every circumstance but one, when the officers showed up, they used utter professionalism. Their training appears to be top notch. Even in some heightened interactions, they de-escalated the situation through what a friend of mine, a former cop, called verbal jujitsu, a means of absorbing and redirecting the emotion in order to bring a tense encounter to a safe conclusion. I benefited from their training one afternoon last year as I headed out to the alley carrying several bags full of empty beer bottles, the remnants of a home brewing hobby I've let slide. I live in my head and rarely pay attention to my surroundings, so I didn't notice several cops in the alley about 20 feet away with their backs to me, guns drawn, peering around my neighbor's garage at the next house over. I was staring at the sidewalk as always, so I didn't see them, and they didn't hear my approach. My arms were full, so I did what I always do. I kicked the latch on my chain link gate and pushed it open in one loud motion and passed through. They all spun on me and raised their weapons just as I saw them. Two had shotguns, and one had what looked like a small automatic rifle of some sort. I was stunned by how quickly they raised their weapons, yet not one pointed directly at me. They each aimed just in front of me, then lowered their weapons immediately. We stared at each other for a few seconds, then I asked, "Should I stand still?" "No, that's fine. Just go about your business," the leader said. And I went on my way, happy that no one would have to wonder why I chose to die over a few dozen empty beer bottles. I believe and hope that if I had been black, their training would have been just as good, and I'd still be alive to write this today. But I can't say that for sure, and I don't blame anyone who doubts it, because I have one more story. I mentioned that it went well with the St. Paul Police Department every time but one. I happened to be on sabbatical, sitting by the Grand Canal in Venice late at night when I heard about this one, so I didn't witness it myself. But one of our young black men from church, a real good kid, about 14 years old, ended up in a tussle with a police officer at our church picnic. The cop, who was much larger than the young man, wrestled him to the ground and laid on him, pinning him while he got him under control. A crowd gathered and tried to get the officer to let him up, while others talked with our young church brother to help him calm down and cooperate. It was all captured on film, and it made the news. The incident divided opinions at our church, and I could understand all sides when I got back from Italy and heard the story from several angles. It taught me something. Everyone witnessed the same incident, but they all interpreted what they saw in different ways. For instance, the people who watched it were split regarding whether the officer used excessive force to pin the young man to the ground. It looked brutal to some, while others said it was normal, safe police work. The other divide involved whether the young man or the officer instigated the altercation. Again, almost everyone agreed on the facts, but the split came on interpretation. Everyone agreed the officer had been frustrated and said some very unkind things to the young man's mother, and the young man confronted the officer. Everything else about the various interpretations of what happened hinged on each viewer's understanding of authority. The St. Paul Police Department made what I think to this day was a good decision. They decided the officer's actions did not merit termination, but they did give him a sizable suspension, not for use of excessive force, because in their judgment, the film showed that he handled the physical altercation appropriately. They suspended him because he let his anger and frustration at something else get under his skin, and he escalated the situation. So I have no idea whether race played a role in his decision to escalate, but I do know from observing these men and women for years, how important it is to them to de-escalate. And that didn't happen in this case. I share these stories to give one white man's experience with law enforcement in the city and to paint a picture of how hard it can be to sort these issues out, even with witnesses. The George Floyd and Philando Castile cases were obvious failures on the part of the police, but the issues involved on a day-by-day basis with policing are complex and worthy of in-depth discussion. Minneapolis made national news again a few nights ago, and my son and I found ourselves in the middle of it. We were on a walk at night in downtown Minneapolis when all hell broke loose. Police cars screamed past us, groups of young, mostly black men and women were running in different directions, and the mood felt much angrier than any of the recent protests. As we approached the chaos, a young black man with his face wrapped in a bandana walked past us and said, "You guys better go home." It turns out the police had caught up with a black man on Nicollet Mall, near where we were walking, who had allegedly killed someone earlier in the day. As they approached him, he shot himself. A rumor spread that the police had shot him, and that was enough to set people off in this heightened environment. The police released a video as soon as possible to let people know what had happened, but the looting and property damage had already started. My son and I talked with several people amid the pandemonium to hear what they knew and to understand what they thought of it all. One of them, a black man about my son's age, told us that he felt disgusted by the looting. He wore a George Floyd face mask, so he clearly identified with the goal of the protest movement. But he kept shaking his head, saying, "They keep talking about the cops killing us, but no one ever talks about black-on-black crime. That guy that just shot himself murdered another black guy earlier in the day in the parking ramp. Black-on-black crime, man, that's the epidemic, and nobody talks about that." And I just said, "Well, I'm listening. I'm not going to say that myself, but I hear you saying it. I'm just trying to learn." His girlfriend nodded her head at me, affirming my decision not to spout my own opinion. These things are complex. If we start choosing sides on these issues, we won't make progress. I would suggest instead that we seek after God's heart and bring encouragement and correction wherever He leads us. And right now, I'm convinced that our nation is being led by God to face up to the racial injustice that we've ignored for too long. We have an opportunity to make progress. That ought not to be about sides. I despise the way the Trump campaign, as a means of dividing us into teams, has seized on the acts of vandalism and looting that have accompanied some of the protests. Sadly, I know the law and order message works with too many white evangelical Christians. If our friends try to force us to choose a side by posting scary, chaotic videos on Facebook, it begins to seem that we're somehow going against God's will to support the protesters who are bravely calling our attention to the systemic racism in our country. It's ironic that many of the people who seem most afraid of and angry about the rioting and looting are the least likely to ever experience it. As I mentioned, we had buildings burned just blocks from our home in St. Paul, and my son and I literally walked into a national news story about it the other night. And sure, I was nervous, but these are my neighbors. We live in the same city and want the same things, most of us. My son and I walked a few blocks from the chaos and sat outside the skyscraper where we both work, beautifully lit up in the night sky, to wait for an Uber. We watched many groups of people walk by, some visibly angry, none threatening. At one point, a small group of young black men and women came by, and one of the women looked at us and said loudly, "We know what you two are up to." We saw the glimmer in her eyes over her mask and realized she was teasing us, giving us a taste of what it's like to be suspected, to be the outsiders in a fraught situation. We all laughed, a shared release of tension, a small restoration of shalom.